The problem is that not only America, but every other nation is undercut and infiltrated by the globalist families, the globalist cabal. And because of that infiltration, every other nation has a deep state.
Hi, I'm Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and this is the Miles Franklin Special of the Week for October 11th through October 18th, 2022. Kilo silver bars from JBR Recovery. These 3 9s fine bars are cast with an individual serial number and are LBMA Good Delivery accredited. They also have the unique distinction of being refined to a high purity from recycled sources. Best of all, they're available at only $3.50 over spot while supplies last. Our number for all orders is 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. It's been almost a year since we've had this distinguished guest on. Wayne Jett is a constitutional attorney. He's also an expert on the Great Depression and has some very serious warnings about what's happening to us today that echoes in a very serious way what happened during the beginning of the Great Depression of the 1930s. He's also the author of The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now, his magnum opus, and we'll talk at the end about how you can get your hands on one of these if you need to, because it is an absolute expose of things you were never taught in public school about what caused, lengthened, and worsened the Great Depression as a partial extinction of the middle class. Now it seems like the powers that be are coming back for the final end of the middle class. Wayne, thanks for joining us here again on Liberty and Finance this Tuesday, October 11th, 2022. Thanks for coming back on.
Thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be here, and very well done in terms of your discussion of where we are. It's a very historic time, one I think that very fortunately from my viewpoint, and I think from others as well, it's a more promising time by far than appears to be the case. But we'll have a chance to get into that. I think you want to discuss some of the things that we've talked about to some extent before, always pertinent to giving a better perception and context within which to understand the things that are being done to us now and by whom, who the bad guys are and who the good guys are. Very important because, unfortunately, for America, we have been misled very seriously by our mainstream media for many years. They are instruments of what I would refer to as the globalist cabal, the same international forces, families, and so forth, who have bedeviled the world certainly all our lifetimes, and actually all the way back before the forming of this nation.
That's one of the ironic things that many people are not fully aware of. Is part of the founding of the United States of America was to escape the clutches of these central banks in Europe, which were choking off the middle class there. People thought we'll finally be free of these by going to a new land, starting a new country under a new constitution. We'll make it unconstitutional to have any kind of currency that isn't just based on gold and silver, etc. You've talked to us about those things in the past. In fact, folks, we'll put links in the description of this video to the series of interviews we did with Wayne about the progression of the Great Depression and the chokehold that central banks have had on ordinary working class people. In fact, Wayne, I quote you frequently in having explained and maybe you can do it in your own words better than I can here, but about the natural law by right, about the working man having the right to put the fruits of his labor into his own pocket, but what the bankers have done to make that impossible. Can you maybe remind people about that? Because that's key, I think, to everything we're going to talk about.
Well, that is central to the entire philosophy that every man gets to vote. Everyone has a say in the society. That we have a process that the Constitution was written specifically to enshrine and protect and guarantee in this nation. Most important, the Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. Most important, it really codified the aspirations of ordinary men and women the world over, certainly from Western Europe. At the time the colonies were formed, I've described recently aspects of how the colonies were set up as fiefdoms of the old world, of the kingdoms, of the kingmakers, the ones that were used a very gentlemanly term to describe their economic system called mercantilism, as if they were merchants, plain and simple. Not the case at all. Mercantilism in Europe was the economy run by the kingmakers. That is, the ones who put the king on the throne. The throne was, in effect, their power of government to enforce whatever they wished and to make sure that their economic exploits or their financial exploits were always protected. Mercantilism came to America in the colonies, certainly in New York. It was Dutch rather than English, but nevertheless, each and all of the colonies were set up as fiefdoms of the kingdoms of the merchants, of the mercantilists, of the kingmakers back in Europe, and certainly intended to be. I described recently, for example, the baronies that were set up by design of the Dutch government in New York. There were two major river systems, as most people know here, but the north-south river system is the Hudson, east-west is the Delaware River. And on either one of those river basins, the channel of the river, those who were favored by the monarchy of the Netherlands was permitted to choose whether they wished a barony of 16 miles on one side of the river. In other words, 16 miles of riverfront property all the way back up to the top of the mountains behind that enshrine that river basin. Or if you wanted on both sides of the river, you could have a barony that was 8 miles of riverfront, and you had the land on both sides of the river all the way back to the mountaintops. So those were tremendous land holdings of the barons that were to be put there, and they were intended to be the servants of the royalty. So that's the kind of thing that was designed into the economic system of the New World, and they certainly had every intention of keeping us there. That long, hard-fought Revolutionary War was valiant, long, deadly, and successful in terms of finally driving them out, and then eventually, 10 years, 11 years later, establishing the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and so forth. So it was a fight to the finish to get that started. But they didn't give up. They've been in this country before and since, and they still have a great, not a great, but a dastardly, an awful presence in our country now. Their operatives on Wall Street, as well as the other big financial centers. They're certainly all over the country, as we can see in the way they manipulate our governments. And the people are still suffering a great deal from the efforts to subjugate us. We can go into those aspects of things in whichever way you think best serves your audience, Dunnigan. So just give me a thought as to how you'd like to proceed.
Well, one thing that you just highlighted there was that the figurehead governments exemplified by, you said, put in place by kingmakers. In other words, those who are put on the quote unquote throne or in the White House or in seats of power are just installed by these shadowy figures who are actually the real powers that be behind the curtain. We've interviewed Jerry Robinson, the author of Bankruptcy of Our Nation and founder of followthemoney.com, and he talked about the president of the U.S. and others at those levels as middle management, and talked about how various elected presidents, once they got their initial briefing after taking office, came out ashen-faced and sobered, and one comment saying, gee, I thought I was going to be in charge, when they were actually informed, here's how things work in Washington or anywhere else, and this is the role you're going to play. Certainly we've seen corroboration of that in some of the recent so-called leaders who've been basically installed. We were told during the Obama election years that the public would have to come to grips with the inevitability of an Obama presidency. We were told during the race between Trump and Hillary Clinton that she was going to be installed and people would have to just get over it. Similar, more in the more recent election, it seems that in every case, we look at the eventual individual who ends up in the seat of so-called power and wonder, how is it possible that they can fight up against, basically they call it draining the, Trump called it going to drain the swamp. Some people call it the deep state. That's what, when we met with Ron Paul at the Ron Paul Institute conference on peace and prosperity in Washington, D.C., several senators and representatives spoke about the deep state. This whole idea of a globalist cabal deep state that actually is above the level of the presidency. We even saw during the Trump presidency when he got silenced off of Twitter, et cetera. It's like, wait a minute. We were taught in grade school that the president of the United States was the most powerful person in the free world, and yet some unnamed shadowy figure gets to silence, turn off their microphone, basically. And that's so many examples of that. Nancy Pelosi saying about the passage of the Obamacare Act, we have to pass this bill so we can find out what's in it. These legislations, you mentioned mercantilism, self-serving, basically pushing in whatever legal structures were going to support their plundering, their robber barons.
I might say that the way they shut off their microphones usually was by gunshot. 1881, we had a tremendously popular populist president elected from Congress, and he was shot within about 3 months. Actually, the assassin, it didn't really do the killing. It was the doctors that appointed to care for him that knowingly infected his wounds repeatedly, running their fingers through them, the gunshot wounds, and keeping them so infected that he finally died of that infection. That's the kind of thing that has been done repeatedly. The president elected in 1900 was also shot, apparently because he didn't want to do the bidding of entering the Spanish-American War on behalf of the global cabal. And that's where we got Theodore Roosevelt, and who was the vice president there in his first term. He served out the rest of that term and then was elected to another. But Theodore Roosevelt, supposedly a great champion of the people and Mount Rushmore. And yet he clearly was a globalist puppet. For example, he was the one who hosted a reception for H.G. Wells when he wrote that little book called Anticipations, that was disguised in the first third or so as being about nothing anyone would be interested in reading. But then it immediately goes into another section that starts outlining the problem that the global elite has. That is, they've got this terrible thing called democracy that's welling up all over the world and giving popular power to people and acting like they're entitled to rule their own governments and control what they do. And that's not going to be permitted. It was regarded as such in such alarming terms in the book by H.G. Wells that they said they had to destroy society completely and every nation in order to start all over again, and to do that as soon as possible. And that their ultimate goal was by the year 2000 to learn how to poison all of the people that they didn't want. And they certainly engaged right from the point of Wells and his reception in his honor given by Theodore Roosevelt. As soon as he wrote that little book, he became popular in capitals all over the world because the globalists, governments all over the world, were eager to do exactly what the ruling families wanted them to do. That's what we've been facing here. It produced the First World War. It did so in a circumstance in which Woodrow Wilson was elected as one of the globalist sign-ons, one who had in effect pledged his allegiance or something of the sort, that despite his promise to the Democratic Party or the Democratic voters that he would not do an income tax and he would not do a central bank, he did both of those in his first year in office. And both of them have plagued us to this very day. And in my estimation, looking at things optimistically, that we're going to come out on the top of this thing, and we're going to be rid of the IRS, and we're going to be rid of the Federal Reserve. I think, in fact, very likely the Federal Reserve is already defunct. It was largely appeared to be put into the Trump administration before that last, we'll say, contested election. And in those circumstances, we have an ambiguous environment governmentally now, to say the least. I can describe it in the terms that I see it. It is not at all the way the mainstream media is still describing it, as if, in effect, we really did have a so-called election of a person named Joe Biden as president. And in those circumstances, I think the world is a great deal different than what we're being told through the mainstream media. They are still at this point uniformly bowing to the globalist controls over them and giving you the information that the globalists want you to believe, including about the war in Europe, including about what our role is in it, including what our military is doing presently as far as protecting the interests of the Constitution and protecting the rights of Americans, as well as assisting with other nations that also are battling the globalists. I think there's a lot more optimistic scenario to be described than you're being told by the mainstream media.
Many people are aware, well, I would say most people are not aware. They just have a sense that prices are high and it's murky how these elections turn out, and they know that there's strife and conflict between various factions of individuals, even in their own families and neighborhoods, about major divisive issues that have reared their heads in the last several years. But I guess what I'd like to ask you is where you see parallels between the kinds of machinations that are happening now, positioning us for what the powers that be may think are going to, bring a final closure to the middle class, bring to fulfillment what was started during the Great Depression. What are the things that people might need to wake up to and open their eyes to and say, oh my gosh, this is what has been happening over the last decade? Or you can pick any time frame that suits to draw the parallels so that people understand what is being put in place. Now, you've also got the other side of the story there about you think that there are forces that are beneficial to people and that will prevail and restore our constitutional freedoms and so on. But before we get to that part of the story, can you help people open their eyes to what parallels you see between now and the things that were happening during the Great Depression?
Very eager to do so. It gives some idea of what the reality of the Great Depression was, because it's so different from what we've been told by so-called historians and economists and politicians. It's just simply a big lie. The academicians have not told us the truth. The economists have not told us the truth about what went on, even though it's there for them to find historically. And the point is that when you learn these things, it gives you a completely different idea about who you can trust, what you can believe to be the truth, and where you ought to be looking in order to find it. The fact of the matter is that our so-called elite universities have produced professors and authors and so forth that have lied about our history, have lied about the actions taken on there, have failed to divulge, have covered up, and they've done a great deal of damage by doing that, of course, trying to convince you to trust exactly the wrong people. Let me give a few examples, if I might, about the kinds of things done to do the Great Depression, to do the crash of 1929. It was a planned crash. It was planned by the big investor elites of Wall Street. In that regard, let me just give you a few examples. The crash of 1929 was a planned event. It was later described in 1938 in interrogations in the Soviet Union of a Western European banker. The European banker was describing the way in which mercenaries were sent into Europe after World War I to pull down the Tsar. I think the historical context within which the Tsar was taken down was the very important context that when Woodrow Wilson said yes to the Federal Reserve, in other words, to a Rothschild-owned private bank to take care of our money, they made the same demand on the Tsar in Russia that they leave the gold standard and allow them to set up a fake currency a bank in Russia to print their money, and the Tsar told them no. So they immediately started World War I, largely fought on Russian territory. Great loss of life with the German army spending most of its time fighting in Russia during that war. Many casualties. And in 1917, what happens? It's not the German army that does it, but insurgents are put in to Russia, called the Bolsheviks, but they were basically paid gunfighters, paid for with provable evidence, paid for by the Western banks, so that they go in and kidnap the Tsar and his family, basically kill them with gunfire within a month or so after they were captured. The Russian people fought against that takeover by the Bolsheviks, by the Western banks, for 6 years, losing millions of lives, fighting against the so-called dictatorship of communism that was being put on top of them. The dictatorship that we are now experiencing, trying to be put on America by the same big bank. The banks are just part of the operations of the big families that are the globalists. But nevertheless, I think people are able better to make that connection. But that's what happened to Russia. With years and years, 6 years of fighting, they finally were able to cause the Russian army to surrender. And of course, there were many executions. They lost millions of Russian lives, and they suffered and died in many cases for 70 years under the communist so-called domination. The Russians were not turning to communists. They were taken over by the global dictatorship, and they were subjugated under this boot heel called communism to make them do what they were told. And they finally got out from under it in '89 and started trying to come back. That's where they are now. And that is why, for example, they have made the first step to leading the world back to a gold-based currency. Ever since I started writing on this subject shortly after the year 2000, I've called attention to the fact that the first day that we can end the Federal Reserve and replace it with a sound currency will be the best day this country has had since 1913, when the thing was actually given away. Because every fiat currency, and the dollar is certainly one and always has been since the Federal Reserve was formed. Up until that time, it was a gold-based dollar, and supposedly it continued to be a gold-based dollar until '72. That's not the case for Americans. The gold-based dollar ended in 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt immediately ordered, when he was elected president, that all gold coins owned by Americans must be immediately turned into the U.S. Treasury, and they were to be paid the standard price then, which was $20.67 per ounce. Well, there were plenty of rumors during Roosevelt's election that he was going to devalue the dollar. And so after the crash, many businesses failed, and there were either bankruptcies or you sell out and save whatever capital you could. The economy was so bad that people were not starting new businesses, so they bought gold, trying to make sure at least they saved the value of what they had. And yet he took their gold, gave them $20.67, and as soon as he got that money in, 1 year later, he then devalues the dollar that he paid them for that gold, and says, well, now it takes $35 an ounce instead of $20.67 to buy that coin. So it was a terrible slap in the face of Americans who had done the thing that he ordered them to do, turn in their gold, and then as soon as they do, he takes back 47% of the value of what he had paid them for it. So that's the kind of treachery that was absolutely the hallmark of the Franklin Roosevelt presidency, and his actions that added on to the ones that Hoover did. Hoover also was certainly implicated in the planning and execution of the Great Depression and the crash of '29. The crash of '29 was described as the most important revolutionary event of the 20th century. Now that was by a globalist representative being questioned in Russia, and he said that because the crash was so carefully planned in a meeting in Europe of the big figures from Wall Street and so forth in the summer before. I remember one of them said that he came back from grouse hunting. He was on grouse hunting in Scotland, in the summer of 29, and something came over him, and he immediately went back to the U.S. and sold every stock that he had before the crash. Well, what came over him was his attendance at the conference that clued him in that the crash was on, and they had picked this signal that they would use to be the signal for all of those in on it to sell, what we now call naked short selling. Sell shares you don't even own. Sell short, don't deliver, because by the time you do have to deliver, you've already collected and recovered and so forth. That was the kind of thing that was done that caused that globalist banker to say that March 29th of 1929 was the most revolutionary event of the 20th century. He said that in 1938, and obviously he means that the crash was the planned revolutionary event that was even bigger than the invasion of Russia by the Bolsheviks. And that's a big thing. So obviously, it had a great deal to do with what happened then in American politics. Who was elected in 32 with this demon Franklin Roosevelt. I've given a personal portrait of that man in one chapter of my book, and it tells you the kind of person he actually was. He was not that warm-feeling person that sat on the and has talked on the radio about just trust me and all that sort of thing, and a day that will live in infamy regarding the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when he was fully knowledgeable in advance that it was going to happen and did nothing to alert our troops, our Navy, in order to protect about it. That's the kind of criminality that Americans have been subjected to, and not just criminality at that level of those political actors, but the kind of treasonous activity done by our academicians, our historians, our economists, that have misrepresented so badly the truth of the matter. And it is that kind of thing, when you learn these things and get to examine them yourself. I think that's what I've put into the Fruits of Graft. That's why I felt I had to write that book. I didn't want to write one. But once I found what I did in the diary, the personal diary of Henry Morgenthau Jr., about his dealings as Secretary of Treasury, primarily under the Roosevelt administration, all except the first year Franklin Roosevelt was in office. Henry Morgenthau Jr. was his Secretary of the Treasury. And even in the first year, Morgenthau was his sort of fix-it man. He was the son of a big real estate mogul in New York City, but he lived on an estate out by Roosevelt in the Hudson Valley. And that was the connection that put them together. But they were by no means these simple country boys that came in and tried to do the best they could. There's one particular thing I'll mention at this point that comes to mind, that even Morgenthau, according to his diary, changed his mind by 1939 after the House of Representatives, the Democrats had lost 83 seats in the 1938 election because people were getting wise to how much harm the Democrat policies were doing on purpose to the economy. Well, Morgenthau in March of 39 went to Roosevelt and told him, Mr. President, we can have a boom within a month. A boom within a month. If you will just agree to this package of across-the-board tax cuts that I've got. Remember, when Roosevelt got into office, he raised taxes or added new taxes every year he was in office, even on top of the quadrupling of the lowest rate and the trebling of the highest rate that Hoover did in his last year in office. So he not only didn't repeal those giant tax increases that were really the reason we had the run on the banks. The run on the banks in March of 1933 was simply people going to the bank to get money out to pay the taxes that they were going to have to pay because Hoover had raised them so high, tripling them, quadrupling them for most people, just before the election. You know, if that wasn't a dead giveaway that it was time for him to pass the baton off to Roosevelt, I don't know what is. But those are the circumstances that when people start reading these things and digesting them and letting them sink in, and they say, oh my Lord, I've been such a dupe, believing these things that our Yale historians, our Harvard historians and economists have told us all these years. They were lying to us. And you can't tell me that there could be a mistake about it, honestly, in, we'll say, intellectual judgment. It is simply that these so-called elite universities have been owned by the globalist cabal. And they get their big salaries and their big prestige and their inside information and so forth and so on as a reward for their towing the line and telling the people only the things that the rulers want them to know or believe. That's where we still are today, but we're the closest we've ever been, certainly since the beginning of since 29. Closest we've ever been to breaking out of this and springing free from this oppressive globalist government that has been after us certainly my entire lifetime and before. It's been that way.
Wayne, you remain both the most informed historian about this of many people that we've spoken to, as well as an eternal optimist about brighter light coming at the end of the tunnel. It's hard for many people to reconcile that, who are just awakening to how grim and how grave things really are, and how untrustworthy, how treasonous, how undermining and basically crimes against humanity that have been perpetrated by leaders and those in power, who are people who are just awakening to that, and many haven't even awakened yet, but to those who are, it's very difficult to see where there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We just have a few minutes. If you could maybe give us the top 1, 2, 3 reasons why you believe, why you still hold to optimism at this hour, because you mentioned the owning of the major educational institutions. Okay, that's one example. All of the major media, all of the major big tech, and so on.
Let me try to do that. John F. Kennedy was elected as a globalist president. I have the particular theory that it was his experience as a member of the military, a fighting man during World War II, that led him to a viewpoint that was more sympathetic by far to the ordinary people than the globalists permit you to be. That's why he was killed. And it was right after that, reportedly, that a number of really patriotic military people began meeting generals in the U.S. military to decide what had to be done in order to save the Constitution, because it clearly was going under with the domination of the globalist elite, killing the presidents that are trying to do right by the people. And it was at that time that planning started, and it's continued to today. I think it was the planning by those generals who passed on to the next generation of generals the same kind of dedication that finally wound up with the military recruiting Donald Trump to be the candidate in 2016. And that produced an outcome that was plainly historic. Doesn't even do it justice in terms of the difference it made in the outlook for the American people in 2017 as compared to what it would have been if that had not taken place. The plan in 2016 seemed to be fully in play as far as the globalist politicians were concerned, that the plan of 1901 to exterminate the unwanted people by the year 2000 was ready to befall the American people in 2017. And it was the effective political action in getting a different candidate, a surprise candidate, surprising even to the globalists, because they were fully prepared and did, in my opinion, steal 5 states in the 2016 election. But they were not successful in stealing the 10 states due to military action that stopped them and shut off the satellites that were doing the ballot, we'll say, corruption. And so in any event, in that circumstance, the action from there has also been supported by military, taking action with other militaries in the world, all fighting the globalists. The problem is that not only America, but every other nation is undercut and infiltrated by the globalist families, the globalist cabal. And because of that infiltration, every other nation has a deep state, including our so-called biggest antagonists. But as we saw for a brief time under Trump with North Korea, if you give them some help in defeating their deep state, all of a sudden you have nationalists in other countries coming to the fore and entirely willing to join with nationalists in America to have free and independent republics as their form of government with the rights of their people to a fair and honest life of prosperity. That's what's going on right now. In fact, it's been my opinion for the past year, since longer than we've spoken, by far, a year and a half. I've been writing that, in my opinion, martial law had come to pass in America, that we have been under martial law since January of 2021. And I believe there's a good deal of evidence of that, and that our martial law, our military, has been acting not only in this country, but also in other countries to take action to, as is required by our statutes, to defeat the action against our nation, and to punish those who are involved in the insurrection. And I think that has been ongoing. But when you have a globalist enemy that's in every nation, you need to destroy it everywhere. And so therefore, there are many nations that are involved in destroying the evil deep state in their own nations. We're helping them and they're helping us, and it's still ongoing. I think the outcome for America is just about to come to the public eye. It's getting more public every day. There are reports available as to what is being done by our military to actually arrest, try, and punish those who have been engaged in this action against the American people, and particularly against the American Constitution. And so that's where we are, I believe, today. It's a very difficult time, but I think we have a very positive outcome, much, much brighter than what was facing us in 2016. and much, much brighter than we've had actually my entire lifetime in terms of putting the time clock a little bit further out in front of us.
Wayne, we appreciate always your presence here with us, always educational, always eye-opening, always getting us back with our feet on the ground and our heads back on straight in this crazy upside-down world where we're being told to trust untrustworthy people and institutions and so on, and we're looking for whom we can trust. We've been speaking with Wayne Jett. He's the author of The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now, constitutional attorney. Wayne, I understood at one point this had gone out of print. Is there a way that people can still get their hands on this book?
Yes, it's in print. The problem is my website has been attacked so much that it's been difficult sometimes. They can keep knocking out the function for buying the book, but it's operative at present. I'd love to have any additional readers that can get. It's still at this point is impossible to get any kind of television review of this subject we've been talking about today. I can't think of one that's more important, but the mainstream media is still largely in the hands of the globalists. And so it's understandable they're not going to let me come on. My book has been reviewed by only one reviewer, but unfortunately he was the best, and hopefully still is. There's a question as to whether Robert David Steele has survived the effort to take him out, and I hope and pray that he is surviving. But he's the only one to review my book. He was the most prolific reviewer of nonfiction in America. More than 2,000 books actually reviewed, not just read, nonfiction, all of them. And he eventually, he first awarded my book 5 stars, which was his highest rating. Then he was commissioned to pick the best ones. And my book wound up number 6 among all more than 2,000 he's reviewed, and he awarded 7 stars to it. The first 25 books, the most important, were awarded 7 stars. Mine was number 6 among those, and then he awarded 6 stars to the next 25. A wonderful acceptance by him and recognition of just how important and how difficult it is to get this story out. And I'm very happy that I was involved in it and am involved in it. And it couldn't come at a better time to help our country. Get yours while you can. There may not be another printing of it.
Right, folks, and that's at classicalcapital.com. Classicalcapital.com.
Yes, and it's just $28. Please make use of it, and we'll get your book right to you.
Wayne, thanks as always for joining us on Liberty and Finance and being here on behalf of our viewers. I thank you. Thank
you very much.
Miles Franklin Precious Metals is one of America's oldest and most trusted bullion dealers. Miles Franklin is A+ rated and accredited by the Better Business Bureau, licensed and bonded, and has 0 complaints ever registered. Here at Liberty and Finance, we are licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. To order, simply call us, discuss your needs, and we will let you know our live inventory, prices, and availability, and lock in your order over the phone. Once your order is locked, the price is held for you regardless of market fluctuations, and the metals are reserved for you awaiting your settled payment. Within 1 business day of ordering, you will receive an email invoice detailing the order and payment instructions. Miles Franklin accepts payments by bank wire, ACH or electronic check, money order, check mailed priority mail, and cryptocurrency. The fastest forms of payment are bank wire and cryptocurrency. Upon settled payment, metals will ship out within 3 to 5 business days. You will receive tracking information via email. Domestic shipping charges are $15 for any order under 500 ounces of silver or 10 ounces of gold. For orders larger than that, domestic shipping is free. The package will be double boxed, fully insured, and labeled discreetly, with no indication of the contents inside. For your privacy, the name Miles Franklin will not even be on the package. To talk to myself, Elijah, my brother Kaiser, or my father Dunnigan, call 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.